Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Security Seminar. Today we're going to cover Chapter 2 out of the textbook, which is the chapter on identifying potential risks. This whole chapter talks about some of the different ways that people can try and compromise your system. In chapters 4 and 5 later in the text, we'll cover different ways that you can either mitigate or prevent these attacks. The textbook starts out by discussing basic attack strategies. There are 3 different categories that the book describes. The first one is an access attack. By several different means, someone tries to get into your network. They're not authorized to do so. They're not coming in through legitimate means. Generally, they're going to get into your network to do bad stuff or to grab data. The second type of attack is a modification or a repudiation attack. In a modification attack, people are grabbing data and changing it, either maliciously or for their own personal gain. The last type of attack strategy is a denial of service attack, where people intentionally get your equipment so busy servicing bogus requests that it can't service legitimate requests. The book discusses each of these attack types, and we've got about a page or 2 on each one. When we're looking at access attack, something to keep in mind is that it doesn't all have to take place through a computer. The first 2 categories of access attacks actually involve human interaction. The first one is eavesdropping, just listening to conversations. In public places, very often people will talk about all sorts of stuff that they really shouldn't, but they have this sense of anonymity because they don't know anybody and they probably will not cross paths with any of these people again. So they end up talking about things that they really shouldn't. Another tricky way to eavesdrop is if you're in a service industry and let's say you come in and service a copier. You might be hanging around for 30 minutes testing things, and people tend to not pay much attention to those on service calls. You can probably hear a lot of really important information, especially if people aren't too security conscious at the location where you're doing your work. A step up from eavesdropping is actively looking for information, and they categorize this as snooping. Sometimes all you have to do is stand at someone's desk, and even without moving things, you'll see post-it notes on the side of their monitor that has passwords on it. You might see some proprietary documents or maybe confidential documents that are just sitting out on the desk. During work hours, it might be kind of hard to get this information, but if you happen to be part of the cleaning crew, or again, possibly if you're some sort of a service tech, you may have the opportunity to look through papers or that sort of stuff. The last category that they have under access attacks is interception attacks. A lot of times these involve computers. You put these in place and then they're silent devices. You don't want to be detected if you are intercepting data. If you're good at this, you can put something in place and then have it undetected for several years. You know, of course, when people find out about this, there's all sorts of negative press and you should have known, but the fact is that if you're good and you're surreptitious and there isn't a lot of real good security checking in a particular organization, you can really get away with this. The book has a real-world scenario that just has you evaluate certain very basic security procedures. The first thing is, how often do users change their passwords? I have some clients that have had the same password for 10 years, and even though I advise them that it would not be a good idea to continue this practice, they still want to do it. In a perfect world, I guess I would recommend changing your passwords maybe once a year would be good, twice a year would be great. The downside of this is that people don't like to change their passwords. A lot of times it's hard for them to remember. If you are a network admin and you have any control over the scheduling of password changes, try not to do it on a Thursday or a Friday. By the time Monday rolls around, people will not have any idea what they changed their password to, and you'll be busy resetting passwords most of Monday morning. The second bullet in the real-world scenario deals with sensitive information that's printed. Very often these days, people will have shredding services come in. They'll take whatever recycling bins they've got in the office and take it outside where they've got portable shredding machines, and so you actually do your shredding on site. That didn't used to be quite so common, and people would have documents that could have sensitive information on it that would end up just in the dumpster. The last option that they have here in the real world scenario is getting access to backups. This is going to be even easier than if you broke into an office and stole all the hard drives. If you can locate where backups are stored, if they're off-site, then all you have to do is grab those backup tapes and you're good to go. I haven't really heard of this as something that people actively do, but I assume that it happens, otherwise it wouldn't be listed in the textbook here. Moving on to modification attacks. I think the book is pretty straightforward here. If you got a C in the class and you want to change it to an A, then I guess if you're enterprising enough and security is lax enough, you can hack in and change that grade. And that is a classic example of a modification attack. Perhaps another option here is with bank transactions. You wire from account A to account B. If you change the account numbers, it goes somewhere else, and then you end up with $1 million in your bank account. A cousin to modification attacks are repudiation attacks, and the example they have here deals with email, and this is really the most common repudiation attack. Most of you, anybody who's had an email account for a significant period of time, will eventually see emails in their inbox that say they're from you, even though there's no way that you sent them. They might deal with, ads for medicines or mortgages or anything like that, but obviously it didn't come from you. Someone has taken your email address, they've hijacked it, and they're sending things out on your behalf. A lot of times this is pretty easy to just discard, but if someone is malicious, they can send out emails from, let's say, a corporation CEO that has, I don't know, off-color jokes or something else that's going to cause a controversy. Even if it is determined later on that it didn't come from the person that it was supposed to have come from, you can still do an awful lot of damage between the time these things show up and the time you determine that this really wasn't something that I sent out. It's a pretty malicious thing to do. The last type of attack that they discuss here are denial of service attacks. And again, the point here is you take existing equipment and you bombard it with requests that aren't legitimate, but those devices end up being so busy servicing these requests that it can't do regular work. You can either do this kind of as a one-on-one or a one-to-many, where you've got one box that is participating in this, or you can orchestrate this on a larger scale and get several computers at the same time participating in the same activity. Very often you'll see this as a ping attack or a ping of death attack. You don't see this so much anymore because most devices that are now located on the public internet, they've turned off the ping response, but others have not. What you can do is send ping requests so many and so frequently that that router's so busy doing that it can't let regular traffic back and forth. Most of the time you do a ping because you're trying to check latency. How long does it take to get to a certain spot and come back? Or sometimes you want to do a ping just to see if the other side is alive. Like I said, most companies have turned this off on their internet connected devices, but you can ping Google, you can ping Yahoo, and I actually use those pretty often when I'm just trying to check network response. Depending on your internet connection, a lot of times if you're in the 50 to 80 millisecond range, then it looks like you're in pretty good shape when you're trying to ping those two locations. The next section of the text goes into detail about different types of attacks. When you look at a given attack that's discussed in the book, you'll get background information and diagrams on how this particular attack is carried out. And then there will be a classification of the attack as either an access attack, a modification attack, or a denial of service. Sometimes it's just a single method, sometimes it's a hybrid. The very first attack that they discuss in the book is a backdoor attack. Generally what happens here is a program gets loaded on a computer. What that program does is open up a vulnerability so that once this vulnerability is established, a second computer can connect in and either look around for data or compromise the system or do something else that's malicious. This is pretty straightforward, and your best method of prevention here is to make sure that most of your ports are closed on a particular box and you're up to date with your security updates. The next attack type is a spoofing attack, and this is really common. When you are routing TCP/IP packets, you're going to have a source and a destination IP address. It's pretty easy to intercept these packets, and you can change the source IP address. Let's say that Joe's computer wants to talk to Cindy's computer, and so they get some sort of a session going, and we know what Joe's IP address is, and we know what Cindy's is. Well, let's say that Susie wants to get in the middle and mess around with this. She can intercept these packets. She knows she can find out what Joe's IP address is, use that as sending packets back and forth to Cindy, and she's pretty much assuming somebody else's identity. That is really a very common way of attacking. I know if you've taken my server classes and we talk about security, very often we'll see that restrictions by IP address or domain name are one layer of security, but it's a basic level. Those things are pretty easy to spoof, and so it might be a little bit helpful to put those types of security in place. But if you're really trying to prevent something, those are not really going to be your best method of preventing attacks. The example that I gave with the Joe and Cindy and then Susie getting in the middle is an example of a man-in-the-middle attack. There's a series of diagrams in the book that I think explains this pretty well. Essentially, you've got a client and a server, and you've got some box in the middle. The man in the middle can either just intercept and quietly listen to traffic going back and forth, and that's all it can do, or it can take a more active role so that it will take these packets, intercept them, maybe make changes to them, send them on to the destination, intercept the response, change it back so that when the packet goes back to the originator, it looks like everything is fine, but you've actually altered things in between. So that's a very straightforward example of a man-in-the-middle attack. A close cousin to this is a replay attack, where you will gather packet information and either actively grab it and make changes to it, or store it so that later on you can initiate some sort of a session using that information that you had intercepted. Password guessing attacks are pretty crude, but they can be pretty effective. The two options that they talk about here are a brute force, where you just have some sort of an algorithm that starts with 2 or 3 character passwords and then does all sorts of permutations going up to 256 byte passwords, and eventually you will find out whatever somebody's password is. Those can take quite a while. A dictionary attack is another form of this, where you take common words and just try those. More and more, especially with online environments, when you type in a password, they're going to have complexity requirements, and they're actually going to rate it as weak, medium, or strong, and they may make you have either medium or strong. They may make sure that you have 8 to 10 characters in your password. So a lot of these password requirements are in direct response to brute force or dictionary attacks. The next type of exploit is privilege escalation. As the book says, sometimes it's because an administrator has just given somebody too much responsibility or too much authority. Very often, though, according to the book, what you'll see is that this is left over from programming, where there's some sort of a gap where an attacker can come in and take advantage of an elevated privilege level. You see this quite a bit in Microsoft updates, security updates. They'll say, an attacker can take advantage of a higher privilege level and come in and do some damage. I think it's pretty interesting that in the tech note here it says, to understand privilege escalation, think about cheat codes in video games. Once you know those and understand those, pretty much you can always win. And I just thought that's pretty interesting that they're using this analogy. There's obviously a whole generation of hackers who are familiar with video games, and so this is pretty much a one-to-one correlation here.